Okay, the next thing we're going to create are our objects for the scene. And what we're actually going to be doing is putting snow on a house type object. So I'm going to go to File and Load Object. And now I have this file called log cottage number 2. Now you're probably not going to have this unless you purchased it off of the Cornucopia 3D site. If you don't have this object, you can just load in the small house, which will work for the scene, although it's not as good of a quality as the log cottage. You could, of course, purchase this. I believe it's around $10. It's a fairly decent model, uh, but the reason I want to use this is because it has a lot of different grooves in the roof, and it'll give a lot better idea of how to do a more complex object. And if we were to do just the small house and use that for the example, it'd be pretty straightforward, and there's certain things you might not learn. So we're going to use this log cottage number 2. And of course you can use any of your own creations that you might have, but I'm of course going to use this specific object because if you want you could go ahead and just download it. I'm going to drop the object first of all onto the ground, and I'll zoom out here, and we're going to go full view just for the time being, and just kind of take a look at our object. Because we can see we have several different parts of the roof here, and we have a lot of different connecting pieces, which is going to make it a little more difficult when we're creating our object. And what we're going to be using is actual metablobs. So we can use a metablob object to define our snow regions and add snow pretty much anywhere. We don't have to worry about anything else really except the roof. I mean, if you wanted to go more in depth, you easily could, and you could add snow to the railings and little bits and pieces here and there, and any ledge that sticks out. We're just going to stick to pretty much the roof and the chimney, which is going to be pretty straightforward. But once we cover this, you'll be able to understand how it works and do the railings if you wanted to. We're also really not going to worry about the ground. Unless you really want to define certain areas on that ground, you can go in and do that. But otherwise, we're pretty much just going to have it going into the terrain a little, and that way it will be kind of covered in snow, almost up to the windows, which will take care of a lot of things. But it's a lot more realistic during a blizzard, considering that it's going to be a very, very heavy blizzard. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started and go back to our 4 views. And the main objects that we're going to be using are cylinders. Now, if you've worked with metablobs before, you'll understand that certain objects can define areas better than others. And we could easily use maybe a box for our roof. But the problem with that is we're going to have trouble defining the edges. So what we're going to do is be using cylinders going all the way down, using a couple cylinders to define the area. And what we'll also be doing is shortening them so we're not going inside of this intersection right here. And that way when we put cylinders on this other side, we'll have a nice blend in between our corner. And what we're going to be doing is creating several objects, and then when we're done, we're going to pretty much group them all together and make them into one metablob. So there's not going to be multiples, just one, unless of course you want to. Then you could define each section of the roof as its own metablob object, which might be easier for you, depending on how much system memory and things like that you have available. If you're using a lower end system, you might want to go off and section each part of the roof with its own metablob object. Otherwise, you could just go ahead and create one giant object, which is what we're going to do, and it's going to allow a much better effect. Like I said, we're going to get blending in between these corners right here, and if we had separate objects, they would just intersect and create a kind of bad looking seam. We're going to go ahead and get started now and just zoom in to our object. And the first thing we're going to add is our cylinder. So we're going to go up to our objects here, add a cylinder, and we want to change our sizing. So we're going to grab it up here in the corner and move it down. And now we also want to rotate this. So I'm just going to go in our side view up here on top, hold down the shift key, and just rotate that so it snaps in at a 90-degree turn. You could do this with numeric values as well. And now I'm going to size it on just a little bit more, and now we want to squash it. So we're going to grab that top section right there, and we'll just squash that so it looks like a nice little ellipse, and we'll pull it out to the edges. And right there should be good. Now we're going to bring it all the way up to the top. And we will be intersecting the chimney in this case. So there will be a little bit of the intersection up there. Of course, if you wanted to define around the chimney, you easily could. And we are going to add little bits of objects. We'll add a sort of a hump in the snow when we get to that point. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more in our front view. And now we are going to just freeform rotate, not holding down shift, and just grabbing our rotate, making sure there's no constraints. And we just want to rotate it about right there. And kind of move it into position so it's going along the edge of the roof right there. And now another thing we might want to do is define kind of our texture right now, or the material of the snow. We could easily do that later though, once we have the whole Metablob object. So I think we'll just go ahead and wait till then. But if right now, if you wanted to get a better idea as you're building your Metablob object, you easily could just apply the material right now, which will automatically, by default, add it to all the new cylinders and other objects that you add when you're defining this area. We're going to wait till later because we can just use our Metablob object and then set the material for that, which will change the whole object. Okay, and now what we want to do is we can just copy and paste these. So Control C and Control V, and now we have another one which we can just bring down. And we want a little bit of an intersection there. And we can Control V, paste another one, and bring it down. And now you can see we started intersecting along the top of that other part of the roof. So we're just going to go ahead and stretch that kind of inward. And now we can copy and paste that and move it up, making sure it's pretty much in line. We could also adjust that so it's still kind of going in. Another thing too you want to keep in mind is that you want to be editing these cylinders so they come out a little bit more on the sides than some of the other ones. So they're not all exactly the same. And this way we get a much better looking effect. Although we are going to actually add spheres later, which is going to give us a nice little overhang on the edges where snow is going to kind of come down, and it's going to give a really, really neat effect. Alright, so we'll grab that cylinder again just by clicking on it in the perspective view, or the main camera view, and I'm going to zoom back into our roof, into our front view, and Control C, Control V, so we copy and paste that, and bring it down. And now we also want to edit how far that's going in. And it doesn't have to go in completely, because this is pretty much all going to round off. And then when we have our other objects in here, it'll create a nice blend. And we're just going to do maybe one more. Because if you notice too, we're not getting completely to that edge. So we could just go ahead, copy and paste, bring another one down, and then we can bring that in a lot more than the other one. And now we have all the way up to that edge. And we can start copying and pasting these and actually putting them on the other side, because it's exactly the same on this side of the roof. So we'll grab this cylinder right here, copy and paste, and T to move that up just to the edge. And we're going to grab that last one, and we can Control C, Control V for copy and paste, and move that upward. And we're also going to be looking at our side view here, and we can see that we're actually missing one of the cylinders. And that's because they're so close together, they're kind of overlapping. So we can copy and paste, and just move that up. And taking a look at our front view too, so we're not intersecting too much. And now if we take a look, we pretty much have that main section of that part of the roof done. And now before we really move on to the other side of the roof, we want to finish up and do this little piece right here that's kind of sticking out. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and grab one of these smaller pieces, just so that we don't have to stretch it or change it too much. And move that out just a little. And now we're going to hold down Shift and grab our little rotate handle down here and rotate that 90 degrees. And by holding down Shift, we're guaranteed that it's snapping in at 90. And now we're going to kind of move our view a little, and we can grab and pull this in. And actually, we're getting kind of a weird effect here. If you notice, it's kind of a little bit of a bug. I'm going to undo that, and we're going to try it from another view. If we try it from the front view, we should be able to move that in, no problem. Alright, and now we want to bring this up just a little. And we're just checking with our main camera view too, which is going to give us a nice overall look at the object so we can see pretty much where everything's going. And now Control C, Control V, and up in the side view, it's going to be the easiest to kind of pull that down and move that into position. And we'll just bring that in so we're not intersecting too much. Copy and paste once more. Bring that down. And now we're also going to pull it in just a little bit. And now we can see we have that nice little edge right there. Where we're not intersecting too much. We are intersecting, but not to the point where it's going to create our object so that it's a huge section right there, or that it blends too much. So now what we can do is actually just copy and paste these pieces right here that we just created, and do it on the other side. So Control C, Control V, hold down Shift, and rotate them 180 degrees, and then we can just move that over. And we'll grab our next piece just by clicking on it, the second one down. Control C, Control V for copy and paste. Hold down Shift to rotate that 180 degrees, and we can just move that into place. And now we'll grab our last one and rotate that 180 and pull it down just a little. And maybe we'll just move that out over the edge. So now we pretty much have this side done, except we still need to sort of define certain areas, pretty much the edges. So what we can do is add cylinders along the tops of our roofs, and where these two cylinders are intersecting right here, we want to put a cylinder right through the top, because that's going to give us a lot more control when we're blending those two together. Now we don't really need to worry about the blending too much between all of these cylinders, because those are close enough together, but we might get some weird looking effects when we're trying to blend these two cylinders together, for instance. So if we take a look here, although they are overlapping, we don't have as much volume down that center. So we can add a little cylinder, and that'll give us the ability to kind of control that part of the Metablob. And I'll show you that in a little bit once we actually put the Metablob together. But we're going to build that object for that cylinder. And we might actually want to do this in a different layer, and maybe even put the rest of this stuff in a different layer. So I'm going to go down here and add new layer. Just going to add our layer to the bottom, and I want to just drag all of our cylinders into that layer. And that way we have some separation between our object and the snow that we're putting on there. And it's going to make it a lot easier too when we want to select all of these objects. See, just by clicking on layer 2, now we have all of those cylinders we just made already selected. So I'm going to close that up, and now I'm going to open a new layer. And actually, I'm going to delete that because it might be difficult to make our Metablob if it's on different layers. It might actually be kind of difficult. If you are going to break it up and make Metablobs for each part of the roof, then I would suggest doing them on different layers. But if you're going to have one Metablob object, I would keep it all in the same layer. Otherwise, you might run into some problems. Alright, so we'll go ahead and expand that. And now we want to add another cylinder. And this time we're just going to add a fresh cylinder. Brand new, the default. and I'm going to scale that down quite a bit, go into our front view and expand that. And now holding down shift, go to our rotate controller and just kind of bring that down. And we'll move that into place so we're in the center here. And move that all the way to the edge. And now just by adding this thin cylinder up in the top right here, we're going to be able to adjust sort of the hump for our overhang, or sort of our where our cylinders are going to meet up at the top. So it's going to give us a lot more control. But I am going to say we don't really need to define any other edges that way. We might need some down here, but we'll take a look in a little bit and see how the object looks once we click on Metablob. But we might not need any cylinders anywhere else. And the reason we don't need them on the edges for sure is because we're going to actually be adding some spheres and kind of stretching those out. It's pretty much the same way we stretched out the cylinders, but pretty much just in the downward fashion and not so much outward. And we'll go ahead and define sort of these little humps that we'll have and little bits of overhang, which will make the object a lot more interesting, and that will also define the edges, and that way we don't have to add this sort of cylinder up here. Of course, if you did wanted to vary that up a little bit, so we have sort of not one straight line, but we do have level humps, or not level, but little humps going across the top. Then you could use that same method for this right here, and by using different size spheres, you could do it that way, or you could just use that cylinder like we're doing. And now we're going to go ahead and actually jump onto the other side of the object and start working on the other part of the roof. Okay, so now we're going to zoom out a little on the top view and move over just a bit and grab our top cylinder over here, and I'm just going to actually drag that out just a little so it's a little more of an overhang. And I'm going to Control C, Control V for copy and paste, hold down Shift and rotate that. And now I want to zoom into our front view, and we're just going to pull that over to the side. And now as you can see, we are intersecting that top part of the roof, but that's okay for that one. We're going to make them smaller for the next one down. So I'll copy and paste again, and we are going to move that down with just a little bit of an overlap, and now we can edit that so it's not intersecting all the way. And then copy and paste and move that up, and then we'll stretch that so it's not a full intersection. And we can copy and paste and just go ahead and bring that down just like we did before. Now it is kind of difficult to see with this view, but we'll get a better idea once we rotate this around. But right now we'll just pretty much throw it in where they look like they should be. Alright, and now we'll grab object on the other side and just bring that side down. We also need to go back and stretch in those objects for the other side. We'll just finish this side up first really quick. Bringing that in. And now we'll go ahead and bring those in. And the main reason we really have to do it on this side is because we don't want to be going through the roof. And if you take a look at the actual object, you'll see, we'll go ahead and change this in our view right here. We can see that there is a little bit of a inside to that roof. So if we're not penetrating it too much, it should be okay. Once we turn on Metablobs, that'll of course fix most of our problems. But now we want to work on this other side. But as you can see, it's quite difficult to see pretty much what we're working with in our side view. And since we can't change our views for the other side to kind of change what we're looking at, we're going to edit our objects here. So we're going to grab and select our object that we have here, and hold down Shift and select our last cylinder object, which will select all of our pre-Metablob objects and our house here. And I'm going to hold down Shift, and we're going to rotate it on the top view all the way around. And now, as you can see, we can see the other side of the roof, and it'll be a lot easier to work with that. And you also notice over here, too, we can work with that a little bit better. So it's good to change your views when you're working with an object like this that's not exactly the same on both sides. And actually, now that I notice on top here, I'm going to bring this out just a little so it's not perfectly even and exactly the same. And now we can start working on the objects for the rest of this roof. And now we can grab some of the pieces from the other side over here. So we're going to select this large piece over here and Control C, Control V, copy, paste, and just move that over. And what we also want to do is rotate around our main camera view so that we can get a better idea of how this is coming together. And we can also take a look in our side view up here. And we're going to move that over. And I'm going to set up our lower part of this roof first. And as you can see, it does break apart, and we have a little bit of an overhang underneath there. So we need to make sure that we compensate certain things for that. I'm going to go ahead now and select on our top view and just scale this out just a little. And then Control C, Control V, and bring that down. And then we're going to pull that in just a little. Copy and paste once again. And we'll go down just a little bit further and drag that in. And now we pretty much have that side, so we can take almost these same pieces and just copy and paste them over. So we'll grab this top one, copy and paste, and now what we want to do is select the top view. Hold down Shift and select our right rotate, and just pull that around, and now move it over into position in our side view. And then we also want to position this so it's not going too far into the building. So I can just pull that in, and we'll just be watching that little piece right there. And now technically, what you could do is actually just pull that in a little bit more, because we would have a lot less space that's covered by snow right there. But I guess that all really depends on your wind direction and where the snow is falling. But we'll just add a little tiny bit right there where there won't be any snow, so it's a little more realistic. We'll copy and paste and move that down. And then in this part, we can actually go ahead and bring that back. And maybe not quite all the way, just so we have a little bit of a slope right there and a nice little angled direction with no snow. We'll pull that down and bring that pretty much into the building, but not too far. So now we have that part done, and we can just go ahead and finish up this last piece. Of course, what I do want to do is grab our cylinder from over here, and we're going to copy and paste that and move that over here to our other part of the roof. And we'll put it right there, so we're not losing any blending right here, but we want that extra just on that second little piece right there. And I'll go ahead and bring that down inside just a little bit. Okay, and now we'll go ahead and select this top piece, copy and paste, and we're going to go ahead and drag that up and move that over. So we're just going a little tiny bit over the ledge. And then we can copy and paste and pull that up and drag that out once again, but not too far. And you can add a little bit of variation there too. Of course, our spheres that we're going to be making are mostly going to take care of that. And copy and paste, Using our right rotating widget, we can move that into position, and that looks like it should be alright. So we can copy and paste, pull that down a little bit, and now we have that extra little ledge right there, which you can see that we're going to need to start bringing them in just a little bit more. So we'll copy and paste and move that down, and then also move that inward. And then we can scale this so it's not going too far in. Copy and paste, move it down, scale that inward. Might have to move our view just a little, because once you reach a certain point, I don't know if you notice, once we move this, you can see our constrainers right here for watching start to kind of shrink inward. And that happens on all the edges. And that's so even if we can't see the object, we can still modify it. Copy and paste our last little piece, bring it down, and we'll pull that inward. And we'll zoom out here. We'll take a look. We might even want to add that cylinder up on top there as well. So what we can do is actually grab our top cylinder. And it's easier just to select this in the viewport than it is to go through all of our different layers, because it might be difficult to see. Just grab this one over here. Copy and paste. Move that over. And move it up. And we might not even need all of these, but we'll see once we start fully metablobbing this and editing the parameters of the actual metablob. But as you can see right now, we pretty much have the whole roof done, except our little overhang pieces that we're going to be adding on. So what I want to do now is add a cylinder, or sorry, a sphere, and just scale that down. And I'm going to squish this now and scale it down a bit more. And we're going to just squish it on these sides so it's more of an oval shape. We can go a little bit smaller. And what we're doing now is we're going to be defining our overhangs, where the snow is kind of drooping down. We're going to pull it in, because once we metablob it, it will start to take form. And we'll just rotate that on the side, and then we can pull that down just a little and copy and paste and pull that down and just paste and work our way down. And now if you want, you can edit these so they're different sizes and you get a different effect. But for right now, we're just going to pretty much keep them the same size. Go ahead and deselect all that, because we kind of lost our selection there of that sphere. So we'll copy and paste that, and now we can rotate it around so we can work on the other side over here. And copy and paste, and then just paste all the way down. Okay, and then you can go ahead and just pretty much continue that all the way around on the edges that you want them. I'm just going to pretty much stop right there, but you can just go ahead and continue that all the way around if you want, and also add a little bit to the chimney, to the top if you want. There is one other thing I wanted to show you before we go ahead and just metablob this the way it is, and that is we want to define a little bit around the chimney. So we have a little bit of a snow going upward. And the easiest way to do that is actually just to use a sphere. So we're going to create a sphere. We're going to scale that down. And we're pretty much going to have the same shape. We'll just squash that. Move it up. And then we can rotate that into position. And we take a look. And we can see we're kind of covering our chimney just a little. And that will add just that extra little bit of slope that we'll need to add the realism. But now let's go ahead and just metablob this. So we're gonna start out selecting our layer 2, which will select all of these objects we have in here right now. And you'll be wanting to do the same thing even when, make sure we bring that sphere down, even when you go around and make all these other spheres for all the other overhangs. But we're pretty much going to stop right now because you should pretty much get the idea by then, and there's no reason we should continue working on this for another half an hour showing that. Alright, so now we're going to use Metablobs, so we can just go over here and create Metablob object. And now keep in mind the preview is going to look a little different. As we notice right here, we take a look at our render preview, and we can see it's pretty much smoothed out for the most part. We will need to make some changes, but if we look in the actual preview within view, you'll see that that object does not look anything like the preview that's being shown. So we're totally pretty much going to be relying on our preview over here on the right to get an idea of how everything is looking. And we can't really rely on this too much because it just doesn't show enough, and there's a lot of missing pieces, and it's not quite correct. And that is because it is a rather complex Metablob object, so it's understandable that it doesn't really show up. We'll find this side with our overhang, just to get an idea how that looks. You can see we have that much thicker edges over here, where it kind of comes down. We'll also notice is we have these nice blends in between the sections here, where it's not quite a straight crease, but it does slope slightly. But what we do want to do is change the overall effect of this, because we are getting some missing points in here, and it does still show up as sort of our ripples from those cylinders that we use to build the roof. So we can double click on the Metablob, and this is going to give us more options, the Metablob options. We can adjust the intensity and the envelope distance. So if we go ahead and crank that up and click OK, and we'll let that rebuild itself and get our preview. It gets a little bit bigger and things start to blend in a little bit more. And now this really depends on what object you're working on, how much you'll need to adjust those settings, and really depends on what sort of texture you want on the object. So we'll go ahead and just move around here, sort of in the light, so we can see that a little better. And you can see if we do want to keep these little ripples here, we can. It might cause kind of a neat effect. Depending on the shape of the roof, we could get some extras that way. Or we can just go in and even edit the actual cylinders themselves and edit each influence individually. So if we double click on, let's say, this cylinder right here, we can edit its individual influence on the Metablob object. So therefore we can make it larger or smaller by increasing and decreasing the envelope distance. We can also adjust the overall intensity of the cylinder's contribution, so how much it is contributing to the overall Metablob. We could also make it a subtractive or an additive. If we do subtractive, what that will do is sort of act as a boolean within the Metablob, and it will remove that portion of where it's at. So that's a pretty neat little effect. But let's take a look now at the surface. We're going to click on that Metablob, and now we can adjust our surface and add that snow texture onto it. So we're going to double click on our preview up here, which will pull this up. But if we want, we can actually use an existing texture. So I'll click this little arrow, and we can use an existing texture to sort of edit to make it look like snow. And what we can do is just kind of go through and see if there's anything that resembles snow without color, because we can adjust the color. That's not a problem. So we'll use this gray clumps. That'll give us a nice little bump in there, and all we have to do is edit the color map. We'll click OK. And now we'll go ahead and double click on that surface. And for color production, making sure that we're in the advanced material editor and not the basic material editor, which looks like this, we're going to double click on our color right here and go to white and click OK. And now the roof is getting rendered, and you can see it is maybe a little bit too bumpy or maybe a little bit too bright. So you can adjust those settings as you need to. Bump would be quite easy. We could just go to the bump settings and edit our filter. By right mouse clicking, go to edit filter, and then pulling that down. And now you can see the overall bump is not quite so bumpy and it might resemble snow a little bit more. Go to our effects and decrease our ambient, maybe up our luminosity just a tiny bit, and we could change and mess with our diffuse settings if we wanted to, just to closely match the snow as much as possible. And you also want to keep in mind too that we do have that snow texture on those trees, so we will want to sort of match those up for the most part, which might be easier once you get the actual full scene all together. We can add a little bit, tiny bit of reflection in there and make that blurred. And click OK. Now I'll let our preview come up. And you can see we have a nice little snowy roof showing up in our preview. And you can see those cylinders too are defining the tops of our roofs. And what we might even want to do is go in and double click on that cylinder, and we can say how much we want that peak to be defined. We also take a look over here by the chimney and see if that little effect is taking part. And as you can see, we have that little tiny bit of overhang kind of going up to our chimney. But one of the main problems is it does still look like a sphere, and that's one of the problems right now. As you can see that everything's still pretty much holding its shape. So we'll change our envelope distance again, and just see the effects that it has. And that defined it a little bit more, so we'll go back and we'll actually decrease it. And a lot of it's trial and error sometimes, just playing around and see what happens. And you can see that actually ended up taking away from it. So you'll want to go in and edit each thing individually if you need to, until you get your overall desired effect. And you even too, you could delete those cylinders. Those are kind of there as placeholders in case you need them. If you don't need them, then you could easily just delete them. But they do fill in gaps that are caused by putting the cylinders in there. And we'll just get a nice little preview here just to take a look. And it looks pretty nice. And we're going to be pretty far away from this house in the scene, so we don't have to get too far in depth with the detail. Plus, if you wanted to, like I said, you could add those extra little spheres all the way around, so we add the overhangs. But now our house is pretty much complete. And now we can move on to the next object in the scene.